The massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber slid open with a deep hum that vibrated to the metal floors. Kim Miho stepped inside, his black diplomatic suit a stark contrast to the chaos that immediately assaulted his senses. The chamber was enormous, with curved walls that rose hundreds of meters into the air, but felt cramped with the presence of 47 different alien species, all trying to make their voices heard at the same time. Miho had been warned about this, but nothing could prepare him for the reality. The noise was overwhelming. Not just loud, but layered with sounds that human ears were never meant to process. The Vorthak delegation screeched in frequencies so high they made his teeth ache, while their wing membranes flapped frantically as they gestured at holographic displays. Nearby, the crystalline Nexery pulsed with blinding flashes of light, their faceted bodies creating rainbow patterns on the walls as they communicated through rapid color changes. He made his way to the small human section, passing the massive Gorvani, whose every movement sent tremors through the floor. Their deep, rumbling voices sounded like distant earthquakes, and Miho could feel the vibrations in his chest. The gas-form ethereals drifted overhead in swirling clouds of charged particles that made the air taste metallic and caused nearby electronic devices to spark and flicker. Lee Sora was already seated at the human delegation table, her hands pressed against her ears as she tried to follow the translation feeds on her tablet. She looked up as Miho sat down beside her, relief evident in her dark eyes. "How long has this been going on?" Miho asked, raising his voice to be heard over the din. 3 days straight," Sora replied, leaning close so he could hear her. "The territorial dispute over the Kepler 442 system. Everyone wants exclusive mining rights. The Vorthak claim they discovered it first. The Nexery say it belongs to them by divine right. The Ethereals want it for scientific research. The Gorvani say they need the heavy metals for their breeding grounds." Miho nodded, watching the scene unfold before him. The chamber was designed like an amphitheater, with the various delegations arranged in a circle around a central speaking platform. But no one was using the platform. Instead, each group was shouting from their seats, their various forms of communication, creating a symphony of chaos. The insectoid Kythera were clicking their mandibles so rapidly it sounded like machine gun fire. Their translator devices struggled to keep up, spitting out fragmented sentences that made little sense. The plant-like Florens rustled their leaf-covered bodies while releasing clouds of pollen that glowed different colors to express their emotions, currently an angry red that made several other species sneeze violently. At the center of it all, Council Mediator Thexera stood on the platform, her reptilian form towering above the crowd. Her scaled hands gripped a ceremonial gong, which she struck repeatedly in a futile attempt to restore order. The sound was completely lost in the cacophony. "Has anyone actually listened to what the others are saying?" Miho asked Sora, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Sora shook her head. "That's the problem. Each species just waits for a tiny break in the noise to jump in with their own demands. Then everyone else gets louder to talk over them. It's been getting worse each day." Miho observed more carefully now, focusing on the patterns rather than the chaos. The Vorthak would screech for exactly 30 seconds, then pause to breathe, and immediately the Nexery would flash their lights in rapid sequences. But while the Nexery were communicating, the Vorthak were already preparing their next outburst, their wing membranes twitching with impatience. None of them were actually processing what the others were saying. The ethereals drifted closer to other delegations when they wanted to make a point, their charged particles interfering with translator devices and making communication even more difficult. The massive Gorvani seemed unaware that their seismic communications were making it impossible for smaller species to maintain their balance, let alone focus on the debate. "Look at that." Miho pointed to a group of small, furry creatures called whiskers. They were huddled together in their section, their large ears pressed flat against their heads in distress. Their natural form of communication was through subtle pheromones, but the chamber's air recycling system was working overtime to handle all the various atmospheric requirements of different species, making their chemical signals ineffective. A new sound joined the chaos as the crystalline Nexery began resonating at a frequency that made the metal walls ring like bells. This triggered the Gorvani to respond with even deeper seismic pulses, and the chamber floor began to shake so violently that several smaller species had to grip their chairs to avoid falling. Council mediator Thexera struck her gong with increasing desperation, but she might as well have been whispering. The situation was spiraling completely out of control, with each species becoming more frustrated and more aggressive as they realized they weren't being heard. Miho sat back in his chair and folded his hands. In all this noise, all this desperate attempt to communicate, he realized something important. This wasn't really about the Kepler 442 system at all. This was about 47 different species who had forgotten how to truly listen to each other. The chaos continued for another hour before Council mediator Thexera finally managed to make herself heard. Her reptilian voice boomed through the chamber's amplification system, cutting through the noise like a blade. The Council will now hear from the human delegation regarding the Kepler 442 territorial dispute. A ripple of curiosity passed through the chamber. The humans were the newest species to join the Galactic Council, admitted only 6 months ago after first contact. Most of the older species viewed them as primitive newcomers who barely understood galactic politics. The volume in the chamber dropped slightly as various alien eyes, sensors, and other perception organs turned toward the small human section. Kim Miho felt the weight of their attention. He could see the Vorthax's leathery wings fold slightly as they prepared to listen, though their clawed fingers still tapped impatiently on their desks. The Nexary crystals dimmed their light, displays to a softer glow, while the ethereal particle clouds settled into more stable formations. Lee Sora looked at him expectantly, her tablet ready to display the human position papers they had prepared. The other species waited for Miho to walk to the central platform, activate the holographic display system, and begin the standard diplomatic presentation that every delegation had been using for the past 3 days. Instead, Miho stood up slowly from his chair and remained exactly where he was. The silence in the human section began to spread outward like ripples in a pond. The Vorthax, who had been screeching continuously, gradually reduced their volume as they waited for the human to begin speaking. The Nexary's light pattern slowed, their crystalline forms shifting to focus their attention on the quiet corner where the human sat. Seconds ticked by, then minutes. Miho said nothing at all. He didn't walk to the platform. He didn't activate any displays. He didn't even gesture or make any attempt to communicate in the traditional sense. He simply sat back down in his chair, folded his hands in his lap, and began making eye contact with the different delegations around the chamber. The effect was immediate and unsettling. The Kithiurus' rapid mandible clicking began to slow as they waited for some sign of what the human was doing. The plant-like florins stopped releasing their emotional pollen clouds, their leaf-covered bodies going still with confusion. Lee Sora stared at her colleague with growing concern. This wasn't part of any plan they had discussed. She had prepared translation files, statistical analyses, and detailed proposals for resource-sharing agreements. Her tablet screen remained dark as she wondered if Miho had forgotten the proper diplomatic procedures. But Miho seemed completely calm. His dark eyes moved slowly from one delegation to another, not with the aggressive stare of predator, but with the gentle attention of someone genuinely interested in what he was seeing. When he looked at the Vorthax, he nodded slightly, as if acknowledging their presence. When his gaze fell on the Nexary, he tilted his head in what might have been respectful recognition. The chamber's noise level continued to drop. The ethereals, who communicated through electromagnetic pulses, began to reduce their particle emissions as they waited for some response from the human. The massive Gorvani stopped their seismic communications entirely, their enormous bodies settling into stillness. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The silence from the human section was becoming contagious. Council mediator Thexera shifted uncomfortably on the central platform. In 300 years of service, she had never encountered a situation like this. Every species in the galaxy had some form of verbal or visual communication during formal proceedings. Even the most alien forms of life found ways to present their positions to the Council. The Whiskers, those small furry creatures who relied on pheromone communication, began twitching their noses nervously. Without the constant background noise, they could finally detect each other's chemical signals clearly for the first time in days. They looked around in wonder, as if waking up from a long, confusing dream. 15 minutes. The chamber had fallen so quiet that the ambient sounds of the space station became audible. The gentle hum of life support systems, the distant vibration of the station's rotation, the soft whisper of air circulation, sounds that had been completely masked by 3 days of arguing. The crystalline nexary began to pulse with a different kind of light. Not the aggressive flashes they had been using to demand attention, but a softer, more contemplative glow. In their culture, this indicated deep thought and careful consideration. The Vordak had folded their wing membranes completely, a posture that in their species indicated respectful listening rather than preparation for aggressive display. Their large, bat-like ears were tilted forward, straining to catch any sound from the human delegation. 20 minutes. Some of the smaller species began to shift in their seats, not with impatience, but with a growing sense of anticipation. The silence was no longer empty. It had become full of possibility. Lee Sora watched her colleague with growing amazement. Somehow, without saying a single word, Miho had accomplished what 3 days of formal debate had failed to achieve. The chamber was quiet. Not just quiet, but truly listening. The various species weren't planning their next outburst or preparing counter-arguments. They were simply waiting, their attention focused completely on the small human section, where Kim Miho sat in perfect stillness, his presence somehow commanding more respect than the loudest speech could have achieved. 28 minutes had passed since Kim Miho first stood up, and the silence in the chamber had grown so complete that it seemed to have its own weight. The air itself felt different, thick with anticipation, and something that none of the alien species could quite identify, the feeling of truly being heard without having to fight for attention. Lee Sora had stopped checking her tablet entirely. The prepared speeches and data files seemed suddenly irrelevant as she watched something unprecedented unfold before her eyes. Around the chamber, she could see subtle changes in the alien delegates that would have been impossible to notice during the previous chaos. The Vordak had moved into what she recognized from her cultural briefings as their most respectful posture, wings folded tight against their bodies, ears forward, eyes focused but not staring. Their leader, a scarred female named Vexthani, was actually trembling slightly, though whether from exhaustion after 3 days of constant screeching or from some deeper emotion, Sora couldn't tell. The massive Gorvani had settled their enormous bodies so completely that the floor vibrations had stopped entirely. These creatures, who normally communicated through seismic pulses that could be felt kilometers away, had gone perfectly still. Their silence was perhaps the most remarkable transformation of all. Finally, Kim Miho stood again. But instead of walking to the central platform as everyone expected, he began moving slowly around the chamber's perimeter. His footsteps were soft on the metal floor, barely audible in the hushed space. He stopped near the Vordak delegation first, close enough that they could see his face clearly, but not so close as to seem threatening. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, yet somehow every translator device in the room picked up his words with perfect clarity. The silence had made everything more sensitive, more receptive. "In my homeland on Earth," he said, his voice carrying easily through the quiet chamber, "we have many old sayings about communication. One that my grandmother taught me goes like this: the tree that bends in the storm survives, while the strong oak breaks and falls." He paused, letting the words settle into the stillness. Several species shifted slightly, their translator systems working to convey not just the words, but the gentle tone he was using. "But there's another saying that I think is more important," Miho continued, beginning to walk again. "My grandmother used to tell me that music is not made by the notes alone. The beauty comes from the spaces between the notes, the silence that gives each sound its meaning." The nexary crystals began to pulse with a soft, steady light that was completely different from their earlier aggressive flashing. In their culture, this rhythm indicated deep contemplation and the processing of profound truths. Miho stopped near the ethereal delegation, their gaseous forms swirling gently in the chamber's artificial atmosphere. "For 3 days I have been sitting in this room," he said, his voice still quiet, but somehow reaching every corner of the vast space. "I have been listening. Not just to your words. Those were very clear. Everyone made their positions known very loudly and very often. A few nervous rustles came from various delegations, but the silence held. I was listening to something else," Miho said, moving toward the plant-like florens. "I was listening to what you were afraid to say." the things that hide underneath all the shouting and demanding. The Floren's leaf-covered bodies had stopped their constant rustling entirely. Their usual clouds of emotional pollen had settled, leaving the air around them cleaner than it had been in days. In my culture, we believe that when someone speaks very loudly and very angrily about small things, they are usually trying not to think about something much bigger and much more frightening. Miho's circuit of the room continued, his pace unhurried and peaceful. The chamber remained absolutely silent, but it was no longer the silence of confusion or waiting. It had become the silence of deep attention, of minds opening to possibilities they had never considered. "I have heard fear in this room," Miho said softly, now standing near the small Whiskers delegation. The furry creatures looked up at him with their large, dark eyes, their sensitive noses twitching as they processed not just his words, but the emotional undertones that their species could detect through subtle chemical changes in the air. "I have heard loneliness. I have heard desperation that goes much deeper than arguments about mining rights and territorial claims." He paused again, letting his gaze sweep across the entire chamber. The Kithira, those insectoid beings who usually clicked their mandibles constantly, had gone completely still. Their compound eyes reflected the soft lighting of the chamber as they focused entirely on the quiet human, who was speaking truths they had never heard in a Galactic Council session. "The Kepler 442 system is not really what we are here to discuss," Miho said, his voice carrying a note of gentle certainty that made several species lean forward in their seats. "We are here because 47 different kinds of beings are trying to find their place in a universe that feels too big and too empty and too silent." The weight of his words settled into the chamber, like snow falling on a quiet landscape. For the first time in 3 days, every single delegate was truly listening, not just waiting for their turn to speak. Kim Miho stopped directly in front of the Vorthak delegation, close enough that Vex Thani could see the calm expression in his dark eyes. The bat-like creature's leathery wings trembled slightly as she waited for whatever the human would say next. Around the chamber, 46 other species held their breath in whatever way their biology allowed. "Vex Thani of the Vorthak," Miho said softly, using her name for the first time. "For 3 days, you have spoken about territorial rights and ancient claims of the Kepler 442 system. Your voice has been the loudest in this chamber, demanding that everyone acknowledge your people's needs." The Vorthak leader's large ears flattened against her skull, expecting criticism or dismissal like she had received from every other species during the debates. "But I have been listening to what you have not said," Miho continued, his voice remaining gentle. "I hear people whose homeworld is dying. Your sun grows dimmer each year, and your food sources are failing. You need those mineral resources not to become wealthy or powerful, but because without them, your species will not survive the next 50 years. Vex Thani's entire body went rigid with shock. In 300 years of galactic diplomacy, no one had ever looked past her people's aggressive demands to see the desperation underneath. Her voice, when she finally managed to speak, was barely a whisper. How did you know?" "Because fear makes all creatures speak louder than they need to," Miho replied. "And the fear of extinction makes them loudest of all." A ripple of understanding passed through the chamber as translator systems conveyed not just Miho's words, but the emotional weight behind them. Several species who had dismissed the Vorthak as greedy aggressors began to see them in an entirely different light. Miho turned to face the crystalline Nexri, their faceted bodies now pulsing with soft, steady light instead of the harsh flashes they had been using during the debates. "Sacred crystals of Nexri," he said, using the formal address that showed respect for their spiritual beliefs. "You have claimed divine right to the Kepler 442 system, saying it belongs to your gods by ancient law." The lead Nexri, a being called Luminous Truth in Starlight, began to dim his inner glow, preparing for the usual dismissal of their religious claims that other species typically offered. "But what I have heard," Miho said, stepping closer to their delegation, "is something much more beautiful and much more painful. Those worlds are not just mining sites to your people. They are sacred spaces where your ancestors' consciousness still lives within the crystal formations. You are not claiming territory. You are trying to protect the final resting places of everyone you have ever loved." Luminous Truth in Starlight pulsed so brightly that several other species had to shield their eyes. In Nexary culture, this was a light of overwhelming gratitude mixed with deep sorrow. No other species had ever understood that their territorial claims were actually about grief and remembrance. "You see us truly, small Earth Walker," the Nexary whispered through his light patterns. We thought if we spoke of laws and rights, the others would not mock our need to mourn." Miho nodded and moved on to the ethereals, their swirling gaseous forms drifting gently near the chamber ceiling. These beings existed as pure energy barely contained within atmospheric boundaries, and most other species found them impossible to understand. "Children of the void," Miho said, using an ancient term for their kind that few beings even remembered. "You have spoken much about scientific research and the advancement of knowledge. You say you need access to study the unique quantum properties of the Kepler 442 system." The ethereal's particle emissions began to glow more warmly, a sign of attention in their species. "But I have heard something else in your words," Miho continued. "I have heard the loneliness of beings who exist between solid and empty, who can never truly touch anything or be touched in return. You want those worlds not for research, but because somewhere in their quantum structures, you hope to find a way to feel connection with the physical universe that the rest of us take for granted." The ethereal's response was immediate and overwhelming. Their gaseous forms began to spiral together in patterns that indicated deep emotional recognition. One of them, speaking through electromagnetic pulses that made the air itself hum, said, "In all our existence spanning millions of your years, no solid being has understood our isolation. We have forgotten that understanding was possible." Around the chamber, something extraordinary began to happen. As each species heard their deepest fears and needs acknowledged with compassion rather than judgment, the walls of mistrust and competition that built up over centuries of galactic politics began to crack. The massive Gorvani shifted their enormous bodies, sending gentle vibrations through the floor that translated as, "We too know loneliness. Our breeding requires specific mineral compositions, but we never spoke of the children we cannot have without them." The small whiskers released pheromones that conveyed gratitude and recognition. The plant-like florins began to glow with soft bioluminescence that indicated hope. One by one, the species in the chamber started to see each other not as competitors for resources, but as fellow travelers in a vast and often lonely universe, each carrying their own fears and needs and desperate hopes for survival. The Kepler 442 territorial dispute was beginning to transform into something no one had expected, a moment of genuine understanding between 47 different forms of life. The transformation in the chamber happened so quickly that Lee Sora could barely follow it all. As Kim Miho returned to his seat, the silence that had filled the space for nearly an hour began to shift into something entirely different. It was no longer the absence of sound, but the presence of possibility. Vexthani of the Vorthak was the first to stand. Her voice, which had been nothing but harsh screeches for 3 days, came out clear and measured. If the sacred crystals will allow us to share the asteroid fields around their ancestor worlds, we could offer our atmospheric processing technology. Our people have learned to extend the life of dying worlds. We can help preserve the crystal formations while extracting only what we need to survive. The lead Nexary, luminous truth in starlight, pulsed with warm golden light. We would welcome such partnership, Wing Sister. Our deep core extraction methods could gather minerals without disturbing surface formations. Your people could live, and our ancestors could rest in peace. Around the chamber, other species began to stir. The ethereals drifted lower, their particle clouds forming more stable shapes as they prepared to communicate. We offer our dimensional manipulation abilities. Their electromagnetic voice hummed through the air. We can create expanded mining spaces that exist between normal reality layers. More resources can be extracted without any physical damage to sacred sites or inhabited areas. The massive Gorvani rumbled their agreement, sending gentle vibrations through the floor. Our breeding chambers require specific mineral combinations, but we can share. If others help us find suitable sites for our young, we can offer our strength for heavy construction and deep excavation that smaller species cannot manage. Lee Sora watched in amazement as species that had been enemies just hours before began offering solutions to each other's problems. The small whiskers released pheromones that translated as detailed chemical analysis capabilities. They could identify the exact mineral compositions needed by each species without wasteful overmining. The plant-like florins offered their biological terraforming abilities to restore damaged ecosystems after resource extraction. Council mediator Thexera stood on the central platform, her reptilian features showing complete bewilderment. In 3 centuries of service, she had never seen anything like this. Territorial disputes usually took months or years to resolve, often ending in compromise agreements that satisfied no one. But here, 47 species were voluntarily creating a complex partnership that addressed everyone's underlying needs. The Kithir Collective offers our hive construction expertise. Click the insectoid delegates, their mandibles moving in excited patterns. We can build shared research stations that accommodate the environmental needs of multiple species simultaneously. The discussion continued for hours, but it was nothing like the chaos of the previous 3 days. Each species waited their turn to speak. They listened carefully to what others said before responding. Most importantly, they began to build on each other's ideas instead of tearing them down. Kim Miho sat quietly through it all, occasionally nodding or making a small gesture of encouragement, but mostly just observing the miracle he had helped create. Lee Sora leaned over to whisper, "How did you know this would work?" "I didn't know," Miho replied softly, "but I had a feeling that all the shouting was covering up something more important. Sometimes you have to stop talking before you can start communicating." By the end of the day, the Kepler 442 territorial dispute had been resolved to what the Council would later record as the most complex and successful partnership agreement in galactic history. But more importantly, something fundamental had changed in how the species related to each other. Word of the human silence method spread throughout the galaxy faster than light-speed communications could carry it. Within weeks, diplomatic protocols were being rewritten across hundreds of worlds. Mandatory listening periods became standard in all major negotiations. Mediators began training in what they called compassionate observation, the art of hearing what people were afraid to say. Kim Mio found himself appointed as the first director of interspecies understanding, a new position created specifically for him. Lee Sora became his deputy, specializing in cross-cultural emotional intelligence training for diplomats from all species. But the real revolution was quieter and more profound than any official recognition. Species that had viewed each other as competitors or threats for millennia began to see fellow beings struggling with their own fears and hopes. Trade partnerships flourished. Scientific collaborations produced breakthrough discoveries. Even ancient enemies found ways to coexist peacefully. The Vordak homeworld was saved through a combination of Nexury crystal technology, ethereal dimensional engineering, and Gorvani heavy construction. The Nexury's sacred sites became pilgrimage destinations for multiple species, seeking to understand a connection between consciousness and matter. The ethereals finally found ways to experience physical sensation through quantum entanglement with willing biological partners. 6 months later, as Miho stood in his new office overlooking the diplomatic quarters of the space station, he reflected on how much had changed. Through his window, he could see representatives from dozens of species walking together, talking quietly, actually listening to each other. The greatest irony was not lost on him or anyone else in the galaxy. Humanity, the youngest species in the Galactic Council, had taught everyone else the most important lesson of all. In a universe full of voices desperate to be heard, the most powerful form of communication happened not when you spoke the loudest, but when you listened the deepest. The revolution had been silent, but its effects echoed across the stars.